Hey guys, so this is a quick video on the Indian farmer protests. You may have seen yesterday on February 2nd that Rihanna and Greta Thunberg took to Twitter and kind of asked the world, hey, why isn't everybody else looking at this? At NO, we've been looking at it since around June or kind of summer of 2020, and we've quite a bit of good insight and perspective on it. So I want to share that with you and kind of give you a bit of a behind the scenes look at the Indian farmer protests. There's also a bit of an irony in this as well, which I get to at the end, that concerns Greta Thunberg. So do watch to the end. So just to dig into it. So around June or so, 2020, the Indian government, headed by a chap by the name of Narendra Modi, passed through new reforms for farming in India. They essentially want to open up the Indian farming market to make it a bit more competitive, a bit more modern, and less reliant on the state. And we'll get to why that's a good thing in a second, but there's also some bad things as well for the farmers themselves. The next thing I think that's worth emphasizing is the scale of these protests. So we're all familiar with, say, the Hong Kong protests, which happened in 2019 and kind of came to an end as a result of COVID. But they were quite large. I think at the peak it was like 2 million people maybe took to the streets. It was quite big anyways. In India, at its peak, over 200 million people were out in protest in various different parts of India. And what they did in large droves is they blocked some of the key motorways and roads coming into the national capital territory, Delhi, where the government sits. So it's a big, massive protest, and it does deserve, as Rihanna and Greta Thunberg said, it does deserve the eyes and ears of the world. And in my view, this is bigger than Biden's inauguration or anything along those lines. This is huge. It's the largest democracy in the world trying to modernize, and it's a pretty major thing. We have been covering the story for quite a while now, and we have articles from The Economist, from Bloomberg, from Business Insider, and a couple of others that kind of go into the depths of it. And it excited me when I seen Rihanna and Greta Thunberg tweeting about it, but it also angered me a little bit as well. So it's great that they're using their celebrity to kind of bring people's attention to some of these bigger topics that are happening in the world, of which there are many others, by the way. But this particular one is very good. But I think they spoke out a little bit too prematurely without really understanding the facts. So just to let you know, they spoke out in favour of the farmers protesting, and the Indian government went pretty ballistic on the back of it. I'm not saying we at NOAA or me personally support kind of either side, but I do see the logic. I do see the benefit personally in bringing reform to the Indian farming sector. Just to dig into it a little bit more and to give you some added context. So first of all, farming productivity in India is healthy in some areas, like Punjab. That's one of the big kind of territories or regions up the north of India, northwest. But most other pockets of India, it's far below global averages. So productivity is very low. About 50% of the Indian population are employed in the agricultural sector, but yet it only accounts for about 15% of the country's total GDP or output. So that means that you're spreading 15% of the country's output among 50% of its population. Something's wrong there. It's not a very equitable system. Take services, the services industry in India, which is kind of the main growth engine, and the side of the economy that the government of Narendra Modi wants to grow, that employs about a third, so about 33% of the Indian population, but it accounts for 2/3, so over 60% of its total GDP, of its total output. So clearly a much better way of life for people working in the services space. So that's number one. Number two is the fact that an emerging problem within the farming sector in India is suicides. So the suicide rate among farmers has been on the rise quite a bit over the last couple of years, and again, it's due to the difficulties in the farming and agricultural sector in India, getting productivity high, trying to earn an income from farming. And what the government of Narendra Modi is trying to do is again, modernize the market so that market forces can begin to come in and say, hey, we don't want to buy rice off you at that really low price. Instead, we want to buy, teas or sugarcane or something that maybe is a higher markup. And the market forces, in theory, should start to level the playing field and make it a bit more economic for, incentivize farmers to grow the right crops as opposed to relying on the government subsidies when they know that they'll just get a fixed price for growing more rice or wheat. So benefits do come with market reform, and actually a very good book that I would highly recommend Rihanna and Greta Thunberg read, and it was recommended to me on a book list by Bill Gates, is How Asia Works, written by Joe Studwell, and it talks about the economies of South Korea, of Taiwan, of Japan, and I think China as well, about how those economies emerge from agricultural economies to manufacturing and then into services, and that is the standard steps you need to make for an economy to grow and emerge. And it's very important for the global economy, for us in the West, let's just say, to see India succeed again. This is the largest democracy in the world, and it's almost an experiment between democracy at a large scale in India and kind of market-aligned communism in China. Obviously, China's model is working far better, and their farming productivity, by the way, is way bigger, even though they have small hold farms, like as in, so a lot of farmers with a small amount of land, as opposed to say what happens in Europe and the US, where you have kind of large hold farming, like one single farmer with thousands of acres. The next thing, and this is kind of my second from last point that's super important, is the Indian government have, as a result of these protests, turned around and said to the farmers, okay, we'll delay the laws, the introduction of the laws for 18 months, and we'll also set up a mediation committee so that you can go back and forth, because a big reason for the protests was that they were rushed through, and the farmers themselves say, hey, we weren't consulted on them, and we want to be at the table. Now, lo and behold, there has been discussions going on about farming reform in India for over a decade, so it's not like this was a new problem. It didn't just happen overnight, as some might have you believe. It has been on the table for quite a while, but ultimately the government, passed through reforms that they probably knew wouldn't be super favourable with the Indian agricultural sector. So for that reason, yeah, they've agreed to mediate and also delay the reform. So you would think that should quell some of the protests, but no, the Indian farmers just want to get rid of the laws altogether. And this is what Greta Thunberg and Rihanna have come out in support of. So I really I think they understand the full depth of this. The last point that I'm making, this is the ironic one that may make you laugh, but will also hopefully make you question where you get your information from, is Greta Thunberg, who we know as a climate activist, somebody who wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from CO2 to methane to NOx. She's come out in support of the Indian farming community. India is one of the largest producers of rice in the world. It's the largest exporter of rice in the world. And rice is one of the lead contributing factors to greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not saying it's up there with electricity generation or any of those things, but it's probably more than airlines, for example. Rice production releases a huge amount of methane, and depending on how it's done, it can also produce a huge amount of NOx emissions as well. And methane and NOx are way worse than CO2 emissions. Way worse than CO2 emissions. So there is a bit of an irony that a global climate activist has come out in support of something that contributes massively to greenhouse gas emissions. If the Indian farming industry was reformed, I imagine rice production would be reduced. The reason rice is grown in India is because it's one of the few crops without massive kind of technological innovation and pesticides and other things like that can grow in the soil. But when you bring market reform, you bring in new innovations, new technology, refrigeration units, and it allows you to produce completely different crops, and ones that are much more friendly to both ourselves and to the environment as well. So there's a little bit of an insight. We have a series on NOAA, so I do invite you to have a listen to it, and I hope that shed a bit of light on the Indian farmer protest.